So all of us mitigate against attacks one way or another. If you think about it, all of us on our homes typically have a lock on the front door. And that lock is there to help prevent people from attacking or breaking into our homes and gaining access to that private area inside of our homes. And we sort of do the same thing on our networks. But let's think about that home example for just a moment. Most of us have one or two locks on the front door and perhaps a back door if we have a back door, several back doors. And we do that to sort of keep out people that might idly walk by and try to open up a doorknob. But if somebody really wanted to break into our homes, they probably could. Take my front door, for example. My front door has a one lock on the knob, but there's also a window pane right above that doorknob. So if somebody really wanted to break into my house, all they'd have to do is smash one of those window panes, reach their arm through the door, and reach around and unlock the door. It wouldn't be that difficult. So I have a lock on my front door, and I expect that to keep people from getting into my home. But if somebody really wanted to get into my home, they probably could. Now, how could I mitigate that threat? I could take it to the next level, and I can install bars on the windows. I could have solid steel doors. I could, and so forth and so on. And most of us don't go to that level. So in this unit, not only to talk about mitigating these threats that we've talked about, but we also talk about to what degree we need to do that. So there's always sort of a point in diminishing return. I don't want bars on my windows. I don't feel that my neighborhood is that bad that I need to have that type of thing. But if I lived in a different neighborhood, if I lived in a different area, then it's quite possible that I would have bars on my windows and I would need to have a solid steel door in order to feel safe. So, it just depends on the scenario, the situation, the data that we have to protect on how far we go with these mitigation techniques. So let's talk about how to mitigate against these various threats. So the first thing we talk about in this unit is system logs or log files. And this is just to explain kind of what log files are. If you think about the example of an airplane, right? Oh, by the way, that's my log for log files. If you think about an airplane, right? An airplane's flying along, something bad starts to happen and the airplane crashes and, goes into a fireball of death. So in order to find out what happened to that airplane, and if you ever watch the news when they're talking about these big airline crowds, unfortunately, there's been a lot of them lately. After I've recorded this video, there was a couple in recent memory. The most important thing they talk about, the one thing that they all say they need to get is the black box, right? So that black box is very important. And why is it important? Because it has all of the information they need to investigate what happened and why it happened and when it all happened. So you have black boxes that store, it's basically the flight data recorder, which has information about all the control surfaces on the plane, the direction, the speed, everything that was happening before the crash. So they can kind of put together a chain of events of what happened and hopefully find out why the plane crashed to prevent that kind of tragedy from happening again. And even things like cars now kind of have black boxes that can help investigators figure out what was happening just before the crash. It's invaluable to have that information. And in computing, we do the same thing with log files. And by the way, those black boxes are usually orange, right? And there's usually a couple different black boxes on most airplanes. You've got the flight data recorder, and there's also the cockpit voice recorder. So the combination of those two, they'll try to piece together exactly what happened before the crash. So in computing, we do the same thing. We have log files that are records of activities. It tells us what happened, when it happened, the exact time and date, if there was a user associated with it, when it happened, and where it came from. So what IP address or what host name and so forth and so on. So we've got all that basic information to figure out what happened. Now, the other question we have to ask ourselves when we're doing logging is how much do we log? So it is possible to log too much. So if you have too much logging turned on, you're going to fill up your log files rather quickly. Your retention time is going to be very small. You're going to add a lot of resources and a lot of time to the application. So if you turn on a tremendous amount of logging, then for every transaction that's happening or for every all the traffic that's going through a device, all that stuff has to get logged. It takes extra time. It takes disk space. It takes resources. So we kind of want to back that off to what's appropriate, to what we actually need. The other thing you got to look at, too, is how much do you really need to piece back together what happened? A great example is a legal case, right? If you've ever been involved in civil litigation, one of the things that counsel will typically do for when the opposing counsel asks for discovery, they'll deliver a whole bunch of records and bury in those records the real documents that they're looking for. So if you know that there's a damaging document for your client, instead of just giving them that one document saying, here's the damaging document you're looking for, instead, they give them everything they can possibly give them, everything that the letter of the law allows them to provide, and just bury that document somewhere in that pile. So they don't make it easy for them. And, you know, a good opposing attorney will be able to sift through that and find that documentation and find that damaging document. But we don't want to bury ourselves in all that paperwork, right? We want to bury ourselves in all of these log items that we really don't need all the time. Now, of course, if something really bad does happen, maybe it would be useful to have that stuff. But again, to what end? You know, how deep do we need to go with storing all this stuff? And it is important to keep log files going back quite a ways, because sometimes you won't discover that something happened until weeks, maybe even months later. And it's nice to be able to go back in time to those logs. And if you have too much logging, you won't be able to do that because you simply won't have the storage space to store all of those log files. Likewise, you don't want to have too little. If you log too little, then you won't have enough information when something happens. So you got to kind of find that nice middle ground between logging too much and too little. And a lot of this comes with experience. A lot of us that are application developers, we kind of figure this out over time. You know, how much logging is appropriate for our applications. And a lot of times we'll create different logging levels. So for example, in applications that I work on, we work in logging levels that are very high for while we're doing debugging. So if a customer's having an issue, we turn the logging all the way up so we get everything. That way it's easy to piece together what's happening to discover what the issue is. But we wouldn't want to run like that all the time, so we'll lower the logging level down during normal operations. But it's at a level where it at least has enough information for us to see what was happening when there was an error to have some kind of clue. And then some people turn their logging completely off, and they'll call us up and say, hey, this application you guys gave us is not working. We're having all kinds of problems. And we go in and we say, well, there's no logs, so we can't tell you what happened. We need to get the log file. So then we'll tell them you need to turn on the logging and let us know when it happens again. So logging is, of course, very, very important, and we can monitor those logs to figure out what's happening on our network. Now, let's talk about some common logs. So some common logs here in the Northeast, usually we like to burn oak in this area because, you know, a good hardwood, although sometimes you see people using either the distinctive white birch or perhaps a chestnut. Sorry, just kidding, guys. Let's talk about real logs. So some common logs. We start with security application logs. So these are log files that are for any application that has any security application. Generally speaking, it's a security application. Anything that helps assess or secure a network would qualify as a security application. This is kind of a catch-all for different applications that we're not going to talk about specifically. DNS. DNS server can be configured to log transactions, such as when somebody does a name resolution request. You can log that request, where it came from and what you responded with, and you can audit that later on. You've got system logs, which track events on a system, so program crashes, when a system is shut down, when it's been restarted, why it was restarted, any application crashes that may have happened that the system was able to detect. You can have performance logs, which track the performance, so this might track memory usage, the CPU usage, disk space, network traffic, all of those things that can happen on a system, or that are happening on a system. And a lot of times we'll want a baseline system so we know what the normal performance looks like, so that when something is abnormal, we can identify that. So we can say, okay, this is what it normally should look like. Right now, the CPU is just going crazy. Why is that happening? Maybe there's a virus on it. Maybe there's a worm that's trying to do something. We've got event logs, which are logs from applications that track what is occurring on a system. You've got access logs, which tells you when a user is trying to log in, if the login failed, or if they tried to log in several times. You've got firewall logs, which will log activity on the firewall. So when you create firewall rules with most modern firewalls, you can actually even tell the firewall when it drops traffic, whether or not it should log that drop. So certain traffic, you might want to, when you're creating your firewall rules, you might want to say, well, I really want to know if somebody from inside my network is trying to access SMTP from outside the network, because that's typical of a virus, right? So that would be a good sign that maybe there's a virus in your network, because any normal computer should be using your internal SMTP server, not trying to get around it and go outside to through the firewall. So you might log that type of traffic, which would give you some inkling that something is wrong. Antiviruses can do logging, so they can log when they if they find any files or any suspicious programs or anything like that. They can also log that they've done their updates, and the next time it needs to do an update, every time it scans, all that stuff could be in an antivirus log. Then you've got IDS and IPSs. We're going to talk more about what an IDS or an IPS is later, but these are your intrusion detection and intrusion prevention systems, and they also have logging. So those would also be log files that you would want to monitor. So periodically, we want to do audits against these logs. And you're trying to ensure that things are as they should be. And as I said before, an important part of this auditing is to baseline what your system should look like and what the log file should look like during normal operations. That way, you can tell when something is abnormal. By auditing logs, this is going to help you enforce any security policies. So, you could detect when people or computers are straying outside that security policy. You have objective evidence when something happens that's outside the security policy from the log files. So some things that we can typically audit through log files: user access, user rights. We can do storage, retention, firewall rules. And by the way, these are also things, we don't just use log files to do periodic audits. We go through and we audit settings as well. So for example, we can audit that the right users have access, that users that have left the company have been disabled. We can verify correct user rights if somebody was elevated in their rights for some reason and they weren't supposed to be. We can audit our storage usage. We can audit our retention rules, how long we're keeping data. And firewall rules is an interesting one. So in theory, you should have some kind of security policy that identifies what traffic is and is not allowed on the firewall. And if somebody makes a change to that, there should have been a change request, right? So a change request, and you should have learned about this a little bit in IT Security 1. Somebody would have requested a change to those firewall rules. So you could take your codified rules that are on the firewall and compare it to the rules that are in your current security policy documentation and say, okay, why is there a rule allowing traffic on this port through the firewall? Somebody obviously put that in there. Why did they do that? And it could have been a vendor requested it or whatnot, and somebody just didn't go through the proper channels and the proper paperwork to make that change. So an audit would certainly turn that up. And an audit would turn up any of these issues through for all of these different categories. So now let's talk about system hardening. So system hardening is basically, well, first let's take a step back. So system hardening, when you get a brand new system and you unbox it and you plug it in, the default build of most systems is going to be fairly insecure. There's no possible way that every vendor that makes a server is able to make it as secure as possible for your environment. Every environment is different. So everybody has different concerns, different levels of security they need. If manufacturers ship servers with the best level of protection and already hardened, I think it would annoy a lot of folks because they want to start with something that's open and work their way to being closed. It's a little bit easier for a variety of reasons. So most systems, when you get them, they're going to have to be prepared for secure deployment within your environment. So you're going to have to do something to make that server more secure and more appropriate for your environment. That process is basically hardening a system. So the term for that is system hardening. So that's what we're going to talk about here for just a few minutes. So the first step when you're hardening a system, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to disable any unused interfaces and ports. So we're going to remove any unnecessary or insecure protocols. So for example, Telnet is generally considered insecure. So we're going to remove the Telnet server. We might disable or remove the FTP server, especially if this is going to be something in our DNS. We want to make sure it's not open for FTP. We might remove NetBIOS. I'm not so sure about NetBIOS on all servers. Some people do require NetBIOS, so I put a question mark on that one. I'm not sure if it's always a great idea to remove NetBIOS on a Windows network. Sometimes you need that stuff, but I'm not so sure about that. You're probably going to want to, if it's a Windows machine, a Windows server, you're going to remove any shares, preferably all shares. Some people turn off file sharing completely, although, again, this is something that a lot of networks rely on Windows shares or UNC paths and Samba and things like that. So you may not be able to remove all of them, but you can certainly get rid of the ones that are not needed. So if there's any rogue shares or administrative shares that are on in the operating system by default, you can certainly disable those. You can disable any services and ports that are not used. I'm sure all of you know when you install Microsoft Windows, any version of Windows, there's tons of applications on there, and a lot of them we don't need. So you can certainly disable things that are not needed. You can one tip they give you in the book is renaming the administrator account. So every Windows computer by default has an administrator account after you run the installer, and you can set a secure password for the administrator. But then the problem with this though is that almost every attacker knows that almost every Windows computer is always going to have an account called administrator, and that account is sort of the one that they really want to get access to, because the administrator has access to do everything on a machine. So if you're going to crack any password on a machine, you want it to be the administrator account. That's going to give you the most access. So one way you can mitigate that is by using an admin account that has a different name. So it's something that it would be difficult for the attacker to guess what that account name is. It would make it a little bit more difficult for them to brute force. They would be trying to brute force an account that doesn't exist. So you can certainly rename that account. You could also remove any unneeded or default user accounts. So again, Windows is notorious for this. They ship workstations with, all the way back to Windows 3.1. They always shipped the operating system with certain built-in user accounts. So you could get rid of those built-in user accounts. That way, again, an attacker might assume that they're there, but they're really not, because you remove them because they're really not needed. We're also going to make sure we install all the patches and updates on that machine when we harden it. So that's an important step in hardening a system, to make sure that it's patched. We already talked about patching and why that's important in the prior unit. And then we're going to physically secure the server. So we're going to make sure it's in a place where people don't have access to it. If you have physical access to a server, there's lots of different attacks that you could do. You could use a live CD to brute force the passwords or change things. And, pretty much if you can get physical access to a server, you can own that server in a matter of a couple minutes. So you definitely want to make sure that it's physically secure. Either lock the server, put it in a locked closet. Most of us have data centers that are locked, and you have to have special keys to access it. Not just anybody can get in there. They're monitored. All that physical security stuff that you talked about in IT Security 1. So the other part of hardening is management interfaces. So most servers that you buy from the major manufacturers like HP or Dell, who I think are probably the two of the biggest ones. IBM probably not so much anymore, but those are the two big ones right now. I think most people buy from either HP or Dell. They're certainly the cheapest. It's the best quality and all that stuff. So a lot of people use those manufacturers. Both of those include management interfaces that basically give you access to the console. So it's basically a network jack directly on the machine that is only used for console access, and it's outside of the operating system. So normally you've got network interfaces that the operating system uses to connect to the network and all that stuff. These are even outside of that. So if you plug into one of these Ethernet ports on the back of one of these machines, you're going to basically get access to the console, to BIOS, really. So if you rebooted the server, you would actually be able to see BIOS remotely and be able to remotely change things on the server. So it's almost as good as having physical access, right? So if you have that kind of access, it's like you're physically standing in front of the machine to try things. So we want to make sure that that's secure. By the way, that functionality, the broad name for that is BMC, or Baseboard Management Controller. So that's the vendor neutral name for this functionality. But in the HP world, it's called ILO, or Integrated Lights Out. In the Dell's world, it's called iDRAC, and I don't recall what DRAC stands for. But basically and you'll see on the back of a machine, if you have an HP and you look on the back, you'll see your regular Ethernet ports, but then one of the Ethernet ports will be labeled ILO, and that will be the console port. That's the port that you can use to get direct access to the console. So one thing we should be careful about is making sure that those ports are not connected to the DMZ. They're not accessible from unprotected networks. So a lot of times data centers will have a special network just for things like ILO and iDRAC for these BMC connections. So they'll have a special network that's completely isolated, that's not accessible from outside, the data center or something like that. That way somebody could do it from a control room, but you're not able to access that through the DMZ. You can't just go to a public IP address and bring up the BIOS on one of the servers. In most cases, you could also completely disable this functionality. So if you wanted to, you could turn off ILO and iDRAC. And the reason some people would do that is they already have some sort of a KVM infrastructure or keyboard, video, and monitor infrastructure that they centrally manage. That way, you don't have some servers you're accessing through ILO, some you're getting through iDRAC, some you can't get to at all. So you can standardize all that stuff with, like a Raritan KVM switch or something like that. So these management interfaces are important to know about and important to know how to mitigate the risk from those management interfaces. So the next part of system hardening is making sure that we have good passwords. So your book talks about password policy, where we have to consider the level of risk. We also talk about how often passwords should be changed, how complex the passwords should be, and then we also enforce and audit the compliance. So, as far as how complex they should be and how often they should change, a lot of this, I've talked about this before. In the previous unit, we talked about LDAP and Active Directory and this whole idea of single sign-on. And one of the challenges I think some organizations face is that everybody wants to move towards the single sign-on stuff, which is great. It's very convenient for the users. They only have to keep track of one username and password, so you have less risk of people writing things down. But the flip side is that you're limited in your password complexity to the least common denominator. So some legacy systems may not support certain types of characters or certain lengths of passwords. I work with one particular customer, huge organization, very, very large company that I won't mention because, I'm giving you some information here, but they're very big. And they have certain systems that only allow 8-character passwords, and you can only use letters and numbers. So they use single sign-on. So that means that every other system in the network is limited to that level of complexity for the passwords. So to mitigate that risk, the fact that their passwords are very simple, most people just use a word and a number or something like that. Because those passwords are so simple, they change them very frequently. So everyone is required to change their password in Active Directory at least once a month. Most people do it more often, and I think system administrators do it every 14 days. And that's just because the passwords are so simple that they mitigate that risk through frequent changes. So that's certainly something to be aware of. That with single sign-on, which is gaining a lot of traction in the market. I think a lot of folks are moving towards single sign-on. It's a great thing. Single sign-on is a great direction to move in. So for selecting a secure password, according to your book, they should have the following characteristics. They should be at least 8 characters, and they should have at least 3 of the following characteristics: either 1 or more uppercase letters, 1 or more lowercase letters, numbers, and characters. Now, they could have all of those, right? It could be uppercase, lowercase, have numbers, and have special characters, but it should at least have 3 of those. It should not have any dictionary words. So there shouldn't be any recognizable words in the password. It shouldn't contain the login name. So, for example, at Drexel, my user ID is BCG28, which isn't my real name, but I still should not use that in my password. I shouldn't make it BCG28 number 1 or something like that. That would not be a very good password because somebody could theoretically guess that. It should also not contain anything that identifies the user. So I wouldn't want my password to be Brian Green. Likewise, I wouldn't want my password to be my date of birth because lots of people know when I was born. You can go on my Facebook page and figure out exactly when I was born. All that stuff is general knowledge at this point. So, you wouldn't even want to use the name of your dog. Again, you can go on Facebook and figure out the names of most people's dogs. It's amazing all the information we can find. We could probably teach a whole class on Facebook and how that affects IT security and all that sort of thing. So once we get this really complex password, we want to make sure that we don't write them down, because writing them down makes them less secure because now somebody could compromise that password. So one way your book talks about mitigating that, and I use this technique, I think a lot of us now use this technique, is to use passphrases. So instead of coming up with words that we're going to remember or combinations of characters that we're going to remember just on the characters themselves, instead we come up with a phrase that we're going to remember. So for example, let's say, I know I'm not going to forget the phrase, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. That's from the 4th Amendment, by the way, for those of you not familiar with it. What I could do is I could take that phrase that I'm not going to forget, that I know, and I can take the first letter of each word and use that as my password. And not only do that, but make it a little bit more complex by anytime I see the word and, I can use an ampersand. I could use all of the punctuation. So if there's periods or exclamations or something like that in the phrase, I would use that. In this case, you can see I've got commas, so I'm going to throw that in here. So every time I need to remember this password, all I have to do is remember that phrase. And the password would look like this: the right of the people to be secure in their persons, papers, blah, 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 blah. So it's all there. I just have to remember the first letters. I have to know where to substitute the O's and the 5s, but this is a very complex password. It would be nearly impossible for somebody to crack that password. So it's a very secure password, and I'm going to remember it because I'm going to remember the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Passwords should expire usually between 30 and 90 days. Like I said, sometimes we use a shorter window for password expiration to mitigate less complex passwords. 90 days is probably a good number, though. I think most people can tolerate 90-day password changes. Anything less than that, people start to complain and all that stuff. But the other problem, too, is if you've got really short password expirations, people tend to start reusing passwords. So you might also have a policy that requires people to change that password 5 to 10 times, every 5 to 10 times. So on the low end, they can reuse a password every 5 times, and on the high end, maybe every 10 times. So if you had a 90-day password policy, 5 would probably be appropriate because it's going to be, at least a year between when they use those passwords. But if it's a 30-day window for the passwords, then 10 times would be more appropriate because now you're getting closer to a year when they're going to have to reuse those passwords or be able to reuse those passwords. And of course, unused accounts should be disabled. So these are basically all of the guidelines that your book talks about for passwords. And again, this is all part of the system hardening process. So next we talk about network security. So we talked about hardening systems. Now how do we harden our networks? So in addition to considering the baseline security of systems, we might also consider network devices such as routers, firewalls, we got switches, modems, and et cetera, et cetera. So all these different types of devices that, and really when you think about it, all of these devices, they're really just computers. So at their core, these devices are really computers. So they have to be hardened just like a server. A router is really a computer. A firewall is really a computer. I mean, all this stuff is really computers. We think of them as appliances. We think of them as devices, but they have a processor, they have software, they have an operating system, all the same things that our regular computers are. They're just more focused on a singular task. And just like a computer, these devices can all be attacked, just like any of these other devices that I talked about. So individually, each one of these devices should be hardened. So network devices contain software. So just like servers, they have an operating system and they do need to be updated. So I talked about how when you harden a server, you want to make sure that you put all the latest patches and updates. In the world of routers and firewalls and things like that, we're talking about firmware. So you want to make sure that you have the latest version of firmware and you have the latest patched version. And all the different devices work a little bit different, but you want to make sure you've got the latest version. I've certainly seen data centers where we find out they're using a version of the firmware from 10 years ago. And I'm not exaggerating. And, in the world of computing, that's an eternity. And all of the vulnerabilities that existed 10 years ago are still sitting in this router or this firewall in a data center. So it is important to keep that stuff updated. And I think a lot of folks tend to forget about that. So many of those devices support network protocols. So, a lot of these protocols, they work a certain way, but over time they discover vulnerabilities in those protocols. And so when you have a zero-day vulnerability of those protocols, you're open to attack, but then they come out with a patch that fixes something in that protocol. We talked about Bluetooth before, and I kept talking about how a lot of those attacks that we were discussing in Bluetooth no longer work because they've been patched or they've been fixed. The protocol itself has been fixed to prevent some of those types of attacks. And a lot of these protocols that we use over the years, like RIP or OSPF for routing, so RIP and both OSPF are routing protocols, and SNMP is a big example of it had all kinds of vulnerabilities that over the years newer versions of SNMP have helped to mitigate some of those. So we want to make sure that if we have a device running older versions of those protocols, that we get them up to the latest version so that they're not susceptible to those vulnerabilities. All right, so continue with network device configuration. So we're going to choose very secure passwords, just like I talked about for servers, only perhaps even more secure, right? And we'll probably use different passwords. A lot of these networking devices, they each have to have their own password, right? So you can't really use single sign-on with a lot of the network devices unless they support things like Radius and things like that. But at the end of the day, usually they're going to need some kind of master password. We want to make sure they're extremely secure. We're going to ensure that all of the management interfaces are secured. Make sure that SNMP is properly configured. There's lots of ways that people can get information about your network from SNMP. The information that SNMP can publish on the network is invaluable to an attacker. It gives them all kinds of information about your architecture. So you want to make sure, probably one of the most important things you can do with SNMP is make sure you change the well-known default passwords. For example, public. Any attacker that's going to try to attack your network and sees that you're running SNMP is going to try that first. So if you haven't changed that, then right there you've opened yourself up to certainly to attack. Anything that's clear text on those devices we want to eliminate. So anything for management that's clear text. For example, Telnet is clear text. Telnet does not encrypt the passwords. It doesn't encrypt any of the information between the client and the server. And most devices, most modern devices, will allow you to use SSH as opposed to Telnet. So if it does, then we certainly want to make sure we enable SSH. Likewise, a lot of newer devices allow you to use a web interface to manage those devices. And if they support HTTPS instead of HTTP, then we certainly want to use it. If it's possible to disable HTTP so that we force only HTTPS, then we definitely want to do that. We want to try to use the secure versions of those protocols. So one more thing about, well, actually two more things about network security. The other thing we've got is, and I'm going to reverse these from your book, but your book talks about MAC limiting and filtering. So the concept between MAC limiting and filtering is you can further secure your network. So take this scenario, for example. Somebody sneaks into your building and they plug a rogue device into your network. We talked about rogue wireless access points before, right? So we talked about that in the previous unit, where somebody could sneak into the building and plug in a rogue access point to get access to your network, hide a laptop in a closet or something like that. So one way we can mitigate that is by only allowing MAC addresses that we know about on the network to connect to our network. So that means that anytime somebody plugs into one of our switches or routers or anything like that, it has to be in a known list of trusted MAC addresses. And if somebody wants to plug in a new device, they have to get that MAC address registered on the system. At Drexel, they do this. So if you're a student at Drexel and you want to use Dragonfly, which is the wireless network, I don't know if they still do this, but years ago, you would have to register your MAC address. You would go to this web page and you would have to type in your MAC address. I think this might have been the earlier versions of Dragonfly. You would type in your MAC address and then you would be allowed to connect to the network based on your MAC address. So basically, only listed MAC addresses are able to connect when you have MAC limiting or filtering enabled. Any device that's not configured is going to get denied. They're not going to be able to connect. The only problem with this method, so this is great, this adds a nice level of security to your network, although at the same time it also adds a lot of management, right? Because somebody has to make sure that all these MAC addresses are listed. If you have a network of 5,000 devices, going to this method overnight can be kind of a pain because you're going to have to get all these MAC addresses configured. There's certainly automated tools that can do that for you. But the other problem with this is MAC addresses, most people make the assumption that MAC addresses are written in stone, that they can't be changed. And most of us know in IT security that's not the case. You can very easily spoof a MAC address. You can go into Windows on almost any Windows machine, and very easily you can go in and just override your MAC address to whatever you want it to be. So if you know that a certain MAC address is allowed on the network, you can simply set your MAC address to that MAC address, and you're in. You're on the network. The only problem is if you try to take a MAC address that's already being used, obviously that traffic is going to have difficulty. But I'll give you an example. If I were going to install a rogue access point and I knew they were using MAC filtering, my first step would be to go find a machine that has access to the network, get its MAC address, and now I'm going to just make sure that my rogue access point is in a different area of the network, through a different switch, and use the same MAC address. There might be some issues with that, but, as long as it's not plugged in the same switch, it will probably work most of the time. It might wreak some havoc for the networking people in time, but I don't care about that if I'm attacking the network. So, eventually maybe it'll get found out, but in the meantime, I've thwarted that method. So there's a better method to do this, and that's 802.1x, which your book talks about. I think this is discussed in much more detail in IT Security 1, so you should have talked about this in IT Security 1. And if you look in your book all the way back in, I think, chapter 1 or 2, they do talk about 802.1, but basically it's port-level authentication and security. So basically you've got three types of devices with 802.1x. You have, and again, you may have discussed this already in IT Security 1, but you've got a supplicant, which is the client that's trying to connect to the network. And then you got an authenticator, which is typically your switch or your firewall or whatever device you're connecting to over the network. And then you've got the, like I said, it's usually a switch. And then you've got the authentication server, which is usually going to support something like EAP or Radius over EAP or Kerberos over EAP. So some kind of authentication protocol that's going to be over EAP. EAP is basically allows the authentication to happen at layer 2. So it's traffic at layer 2. So it allows you to encapsulate authentication traffic at layer 2. So layer 2 devices are able to support this authentication. Now, the layer 2 device is not actually doing the authentication. That's usually a real server somewhere doing that. But the authenticator, which is usually the switch, is allowing that traffic to pass. And basically the process is you connect your port. So you connect into a port, you connect a new machine. It could be wireless or wired, it doesn't matter. But they attempt to connect to the network. That port is unauthorized by default. So the only traffic that will be passed through that port while it's unauthorized is EAP traffic, which is that layer 2 traffic for the authentication. But once that authentication is successful, so once the user or the supplicant is authenticated to the network, then the port is authorized and will begin passing all traffic. All TCP traffic and UDP traffic will start traversing through that port. So that's basically how it works. The nice thing about this is that A, it's a little bit more secure than MAC filtering, and B, it's a lot easier to set up, right? You've got one centralized authentication server, and you're not really worrying about MAC addresses anymore. You're actually worrying about people. You're worrying about devices. This is compatible with Windows XP and up. So anything that's Windows XP or better is probably going to work with this. The only problem with this method is it's not commonly supported with Linux and Unix. So you can do this from Linux and Unix, don't get me wrong, but it's a little bit harder to set this up, especially when you've got embedded Linux and Unix systems like printers, for example, usually have an embedded Linux kernel, and they may not have all the packages and software that it needs to use this. In that case, you need some kind of a workaround. You need another way to do this. So we kind of fall back on MAC filtering in that case. So what we do is we say we're going to use 802.1x protocols for all devices to connect to the network, but then you'll also have a MAC authentication bypass, or MAB. So this will be a list of MAC addresses that are allowed to bypass that authentication. So this could be any Linux or Unix devices that perhaps don't have the ability to do this, or even embedded Windows systems that don't have the ability to do this. So you would certainly have some kind of roadmap for people to get around this. So that's basically what 802.1x is. And the important takeaway in this unit is that it's more secure than MAC filtering, and it's a great way to harden our network to get better network security. So if somebody can't just walk into our network and start plugging in devices. So finally, we're talking about disabling unused ports and interfaces. So just like servers, we can harden by disabling unused services and ports on our network devices. We can disable any open ports, any switch ports. So if you've got a 48-port switch, but you're only using 24 of those ports, you can disable all the other ones. And if you can't disable them, you can put them in an isolated VLAN, or if you plug something into them, the traffic's not going to go anywhere. It'll be disconnected from the active ports. That way, if you've got a jack somewhere in the building that's unused, it's not going to get, somebody can't just connect to it and start using the network. So yet another layer of security. And I think in IT Security 1, you talk about this idea of defense in depth. And this is part of that whole idea of defense in depth. Just because we have 802.1x doesn't mean we can't also disable ports on our routers and our firewalls. So it's similar to implicit deny. If it's not needed, then just remove it. Make sure it's not there and it's not available. We also have to protect against rogue devices. And a lot of the things that we talked about so far in network security, the last 3 topics we talked about for network security and network hardening have been to protect ourselves from rogue devices. So these can be devices that are physically connected to the network. Great example is a laptop in a closet. Some of you may be familiar with the guy that invented Reddit, who installed a laptop in a closet at MIT and was siphoning off academic journal articles from that laptop and making it searchable on the internet for free, because normally you have to pay a lot of money for those articles. So they found the laptop in a closet, and you can read all about it, but they filed federal charges against the poor guy, and it's a big scandal, how it went down, and MIT maybe didn't handle it the best way, and perhaps they tried to charge him and put him in jail for life. He ended up committing suicide, unfortunately. So But that's basically the kind of attack that you're protecting against with rogue devices. So we already talked about wireless rogue devices, but you've also got somebody can install a rogue server in a closet somewhere. Sometimes you have benign use of rogue devices, which can also increase risk. So an example of that is all this BYOD. We're going to talk about BYOD in the next part of the course. So after the midterm, we're going to talk about bring your own device. We're going to talk about alternative environments and things like that and how to help protect ourselves against that stuff. But when I say benign use of these devices, these are people that are bringing in rogue devices, but they don't have the intent of breaking into the network. These maybe are just employees that, I'll give you a good example. Your phone probably supports playing music, right? And a lot of us play music over our phones, but if you want to listen to music at work and you don't want to use your wireless bandwidth, you could just connect to the Wi-Fi network and stream it that way. So that would be a rogue device, really, at that point, if it's not authorized. The other thing you could do is you could turn on the Wi-Fi hotspot so that the employee could then use their personal laptop or something while they're at work. And, maybe it's okay to do that, but now we've got all these rogue devices laying around our network, and, we get a little bit more relaxed about that, I think, with all these rogue devices laying around. So we have to be aware of that and try to mitigate that. So all networks should have some mechanism in place to detect and isolate these rogue devices. And it's a little out of scope for this unit, but you do talk about that in other courses, and of course we'll look at this a little bit in this course as well. So next, your book talks about security posture, another part of mitigating risk. So very broadly, security posture refers to technical and non-technical policies, procedures, and controls in IT security. So in this unit, we talk about the degree to which these are implemented. So it's a function of system configuration and settings and the set of users that have the ability to modify them. That's how your book defines security posture in this unit. I would use the more broad definition, technical and non-technical policies, procedures, and controls. It's the real definition of security posture. But again, in this unit, they talk about a function of the system configuration and settings and the users that have the ability to modify them. It's kind of a more focused way of looking at this idea of security posture. So when we talk about security posture, they bring up this idea of baselines. I've mentioned the term baseline once or twice when we talked about system hardening and network security. So what is a baseline? A baseline is basically a structured approach to system hardening. So basically, a baseline is all of the hardening techniques that we've described previously. You do all that stuff, but as you're doing that, you're documenting it as you're implementing it, and you're using that to establish a baseline. So you say, okay, here's all the best practices for system hardening. Let's take a base system that is this type of system, say Windows 2008 R2 that's running a web server, and go through this whole process of hardening it. We're going to test it, make sure that it holds up, that this is appropriate for our organization, and now we establish this as our baseline. So every combination of function and software is baselined. So different types of servers. So in a lot of organizations, you can't possibly do every type of server. So a lot of times they'll do something like web servers, network security, and then application servers. And application servers is kind of just a catch-all for anything that doesn't fit into any of the other categories, and it's just reasonable things that you would do on just about any server. And then this can be referenced as a procedure for when you're building new systems. So if somebody's building a new system, they don't have to think about how to harden. They could just follow a checklist and say, okay, here's all the things that we know that we do in our organization to harden a system. And even better, you can just build a system to the baseline and take a snapshot of it. A lot of us are using virtual environments now. So when you build your base system for your virtual environment, when somebody says, hey, I need a Windows 2008 R2 server, you've already got a system ready to go that's baselined. That's your template system. You just make a copy of it, and boom, you've got your baseline ready to go system. So it takes a lot of the human error out of this. And a lot of times, baseline can be a lot of steps. So any little thing you could do to get rid of human error is certainly a good thing. And virtualization has been great for that. Lots of great things about virtualization. As far as security posture goes, they also talk about updates and patches. So three things. There's three terms they talk about in your book. You've got hotfix, which is a small update that addresses a specific issue. You've got a patch, which is more formal, typically a larger update that addresses several or many issues. And then a service pack, which is basically a combination of hotfixes and patches. And it could be hundreds of hotfixes and patches, all in one big service pack. So a lot of times you know that you can baseline to a certain service pack, And then you only have to do a couple patches and hot fixes to get up to the latest version. And then later on, when the next service pack comes out, that becomes your new baseline. So important to know the vernacular of updates. We've got hot fixes, patches, and service packs. So monitoring and remediation. So for monitoring, we want to monitor that we have automatic updates happening. So if we enable automatic updates, hopefully that we are automatically updating our systems. We'll talk more about that later on, whether or not that's a good idea. There's different times when maybe we don't want to do that. So in those cases, we'll do manual updates because a lot of times we have to test those updates. So a lot of software vendors will tell you, you can't do Windows updates with our software because it could break something. We're going to test them first and let you know when it's okay to implement those. And most large organizations, they're not just going to roll out patches as soon as Microsoft releases them. They're probably going to do a little bit of testing first. It just depends on the organization. But in most places that I work with, they usually don't just push patches everywhere. They're going to test them first. Or they might have different categories of systems. So, I work mostly in the hospital market. So when it's a clinical system, we usually hold off on patches because we don't want to impact the ability of clinicians to provide care because we installed a patch that makes stuff stop working. But for other things that are non-critical, we might just go ahead and install patches, and if stuff doesn't work, we can roll it back. We don't have to test as much. And a lot of that stuff is more mainstream supported stuff, so a lot of times we don't have issues with patches on those sorts of things. But for very specific clinical applications, a lot of times that stuff is sort of like a Rube Goldberg machine, and you change one thing and all of a sudden everything stops working. So we have to be very careful with those types of applications, which, by the way, goes back to IT security. Availability is a very important part of IT security, and in the clinical world, that availability is paramount to all of the others, because if we don't have available systems, we can't provide patient care, and that's a huge concern. So that triad for us, it's very heavily weighted on the availability side. So remediation, patching, updating, configuration changes, architectural changes, system redesign, and so forth and so on. Finally, reporting. So for security posture, they talk about reporting. Your book talks about alerts, which might alert an operator that something is wrong, or an alarm. And then you could do trending. And trending, so alerts and alarms are basically messages that go out to somebody in IT security and say, hey, something just happened that needs attention. So that would be an example of an alert or an alarm. Whereas trending is when you're looking at, you have a baseline of, and there's that word again, so you have a baseline of things happening on the network that you know is the normal conditions. And then when something abnormal starts to happen, you can recognize that. So you say, wait a minute, how come there's a spike in this type of traffic? And that could be indicative of some kind of an attack or a virus or what have you. So knowing when things are not normal is important. So trending can help you identify that. Last topic, I know we're getting close to an hour here, and I try to keep these under an hour. IDS and SIPS, I mentioned these briefly before. So an IDS is an intrusion detection system, which is designed to detect and alert to possible threats. You could take an entire class here at Drexel on intrusion detection system. It's a little outside the scope of this course to explain how it all works, but suffice it to say an intrusion detection system is basically monitoring the network, monitoring hosts. It's combining all of this stuff that's happening on the network. So, for example, if things are happening on the network and you're only looking at an isolated host, you may not recognize that an attack is happening. But when you combine information happening on many different hosts, along with what's happening on the firewalls, along with the trending and the performance monitoring, you take all the things that we've talked about so far, with all the logging that we talked about, you can combine all that stuff and get a real sense of what's happening. And there's software that's designed to do that. Humans are not usually very good at discerning these intricate patterns, but computers obviously are very good at finding these patterns. And you can think of an IDS, the way I always explain an IDS to beginners is it's like an antivirus for your entire network. So an antivirus on a host or on a single machine is designed to look for viruses on that single machine by looking at signatures that are indicative of a virus, whereas an IDS is looking at signatures across the entire network. So they're analyzing everything happening on the network and looking for those signatures, just like an antivirus would. So it works very similar. An IPS, by the way, important thing about an intrusion detection system is it doesn't fix anything. It just alerts you that there's a problem. So an antivirus is a little different in that most antiviruses will not only detect the virus, but will also fix that virus or repair that damage that that virus is going to inflict. Whereas an IDS does not do that. It just tells everybody, hey, something bad is happening. Here's what's happening on the network right now. An IPS is a little bit different. It's an intrusion prevention system. It contains an IDS, so everything I talked about with IDS is there in an IPS, but in addition to what the IDS does, it can also take automatic action to protect against those threats. So obviously with an IDS, if you're alerting an analyst that something bad is happening, you have to wait for an analyst, a person, in other words, to go and mitigate that threat or do something about that threat. So an IPS is a little bit different. An IPS can automatically take action. That can happen much faster than a human, right? So now not everything can be automatically protected, but things that can be, the IPS is capable of doing that. So sort of like an antivirus popping up and saying, hey, there's a virus on your computer. You should do something about that. That would be kind of like an IDS, where an IPS tells you, hey, I found the virus and I isolated it. It's over here and you can go check it out if you want, but I've already protected you from that. So with an IPS, you don't just let it run on autopilot and walk away. You're certainly going to take action. So when it does find something and something happens, you're not just going to ignore it. You're going to say, okay, why were we attacked? What happened? Let's figure out what it was, and then we know how to better protect ourselves so it doesn't happen again. You don't have to worry about those types of threats. All right, so we talked about a lot of stuff in this unit. We talked about monitoring your logs, hardening specific systems, and then hardening our network. I talked to you broadly about security posture and related that back to some of the material. And then finally, I talked about IDS and IPS very briefly. If you have any questions, please let me know, and thanks for watching.